In 1876, the terrifying story of the creepy Fenwick family and the ghosts they tried to hide came out in the Missouri Ozarks. A well-sealed well with new stone, a respected family living on a lonely ridge, a poor house ledger with children's names written in pencil and then erased, a school teacher who noticed faces were missing after the winter thaw, and receipts for quicklime from the feed store, but no fields were ever treated. One teacher's careful list of the missing people and a child's drawing of a dark hole under the floor finally brought their secret to light. But after the county judge threw out the evidence and the church stopped talking, who was left to speak up for the kids? And if the law didn't act, what would the land itself want in return? Please let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there in the comments. If you care about justice for the forgotten, sign up to keep their story alive. Not a scream, but the dry scratch of a pen on brittle paper starts the story. There was an open ledger in the county seat's clerk's office. It smelled like damp wool and old stove ash. The year 1876 was the worst year for the poorhouse. The leather cover cracked like dried mud, and the pages turned yellow with age. The clerk, a man whose job it was to keep track of every person who cost the county a penny, had a neat hand. He wrote down the births, deaths, and people who came to him when they had nowhere else to go. But on one page, next to the Fenwick family entry, he had written something in the margin that looked like it had been written in a hurry. The ink was a little darker, as if he had pressed it with sudden urgency. The note said, "Fenwick children taken in, no birth records, no baptism." It was a small detail, just one of many bureaucratic loose ends in a place full of them. But in the Ozark Hills, where a person's name and their place in the church book were the stones upon which a life was built, it was strange. It was the first thread pulled from a tapestry of quiet. The Ozarks were their own world back then, a network of ridge farms and deep, dark hollows where the seasons and the sound of church bells ringing across the valleys on Sunday mornings ruled life. People could take care of themselves, but they also kept an eye on things. A neighbor could tell when a barn's lantern was lit too late, the sound of a strange wagon on a gravel road, and the look of another person's chimney smoke. People in the community were bound by hardship and an unspoken agreement. You looked out for your own, but you didn't get involved unless you had to. The real test was in the winter. Snow could block the roads for weeks, making each homestead an island. What you had stored was important for your survival, and you could trust that if things got really bad, the men from the next farm over would come through the drifts to help. Miss Clara Dobbins came into this world of being alone and always on the lookout. She was 24 years old and the new school teacher. She was quiet and had a will that was as strong as the granite in the area. She thought that everyone should have the right to an education, but she also believed in order. She thought that writing down a name was a promise. A child in her class was a soul that needed to be counted, not just by the county, but also by God and history itself. She kept a very detailed attendance log, and her handwriting was as neat and steady as her beliefs. In clear black ink, the names, ages, and enrollment dates of each child were written down. This simple act of keeping records and insisting on order was what first revealed the rot that was hiding in plain sight. Ephraim and Martha Fenwick signed their son up for school in the fall of 1876. They told me his name was John. He was quiet and small for his age. His eyes looked like they were watching something just over his shoulder. Clara wrote about him in her log. He stayed there for 3 weeks. He learned how to write. He made a picture of a house that didn't have any windows. Then, on a Monday, he left. Mrs. Fenwick told Clara that the boy had been sent to live with relatives in Arkansas because the air there was better for his lungs. It was a believable story. Clara put a small pencil mark next to his name as kids came and went. A few months later, after the first big snow had melted, the Fenwicks brought home another child, this time a girl. They told her name was Sarah. She also stayed for less than a month before being sent away, this time to live with an aunt in Springfield. The pattern started to take shape, a slow, creepy beat of coming and going. A child would come to the Fenwick farm. People sometimes called them cousins, and other times they were distant relatives who were taken in out of kindness. For a few weeks, maybe a season, they would be seen. They would sign up for Clara's school, and then their names would be written down in her ledger. After that, they would disappear. The excuses were always believable and well thought out. They found a better home. They had to move because they were sick. A parent who had been gone for a long time had come back, but the kids never wrote back. There were never any letters from Arkansas or Springfield. They just stopped existing. The most disturbing thing happened the next spring. There was a boy named Thomas Fenwick who went to school. He was a shy kid who never spoke louder than a whisper. Clara was sure she knew his face. She went back through her log, page by page, tracing the names of the kids who had come and gone with her finger. She found him. 6 months ago, he had been registered for 2 weeks under the name Samuel. When she gently asked the boy if anyone had ever called him Samuel, he looked at her with wide, scared eyes and shook his head. He didn't go to school the next day. No one ever saw him again. Clara's quiet doubt turned into a cold fear. She made her own private ledger with the names, the dates they came, and the dates they left. The list kept getting longer. She understood that the Fenwicks weren't taking kids in. They were eating them. The farm itself, which was on a windy hollow at the edge of the county, started to seem dangerous. When asked, neighbors would admit to strange things. They said that sometimes, even in the dead of winter when no one should be outside, you could hear laughter coming from the Fenwicks' root cellar late at night. Ephraim Fenwick told travelers on the road the next day that there were no children on his farm, even though they had seen small faces in the windows. The homestead was a place where things didn't always make sense, where stories didn't always match up, and where kids came and went but never seemed to get old enough to leave. The teacher's careful list of names was now a list of the dead, a silent protest against the happy couple who lived in the hollow and went to church. It was still not clear what the truth was, but the shape of it was becoming very clear. The danger wasn't in the woods, the winter, or the wild animals that lived on the ridges. The Fenwick homestead itself was the threat. Clara Dobbins wasn't the only one who kept records. Agnes Miller, the town's midwife, lived in a small cabin on the other side of the valley. She kept a diary there. For 30 years, she had written down every fever, every birth, and every death in a worn, leather-bound book. Her entries were short, to the point, and written in a spidery script. Over the years, she had written about the Fenwick farm many times. One from 1875 said that they were called to the house for Martha Fenwick, who was sick. The midwife wrote, administered tonics for rest. A few months later, she wrote again, called again to the Fenwick place. A baby boy did not do well. It was a common phrase that was a soft way to say that someone had died. But in Agnes's diary, the Fenwick name came up 3 times in 5 years, always for babies who seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly, with no record of their birth. The midwife also wrote down the weather. In the spring of 1877, she wrote about heavy rains that lasted for a week. These rains turned the creeks into muddy torrents and flooded the wells of half the farms in the county. She did, however, notice that the Fenwick's well, which was on low ground, stayed clear. A neighbor told her that a new stone cap had been put on it recently, making it as tight as a drum. The midwife thought it was strange to close a well right before the spring rains, when fresh water was most needed. The pattern of strange things wasn't just in diaries. The owner of the feed store in town kept records of every sale. He was the kind of man who could tell you who bought what and when. He remembered that every spring, without fail, Ephraim Fenwick would buy 2 big bags of quicklime. It was used to treat soil, but Fenwick's fields were rocky, so he only planted a small garden. The owner of the store also had receipts for wood. Fenwick had bought enough wood over the course of several years to build a mile of fence, but he never got any new fences on his land. The old ones just got worse. The wood, like the kids, just vanished. Rumors about Ephraim Fenwick himself started to spread, coming from the memories of the old men who met at the town hall. Many of them were veterans who had fought in the war. They thought of a younger Ephraim, a man who had gone off to fight with a heavy heart. But the man who came back was not the same. They said he came back with a cruel love of order. He ran his farm like a military base, where everyone had to follow orders and be quiet. They said his eyes were cold and his body was still, but not in a peaceful way. It was like a predator waiting for its chance. The whispers and ledgers made things look bad, but the land itself had the most damning proof. The Fenwick family plot was a small, overgrown area of land behind the house that was full of weeds. The stones were just plain field stones that had been carved by hand. As Clara Dobbins walked by one afternoon, she felt a chill as she read the words. One stone was for a 2-year-old child who had died, and the other was for a 7-year-old child who had died. Both had died in the same year, but no one in the county remembered the Fenwicks losing 2 kids at once. Some stones only had initials on them, and the rain had worn away the dates. It seemed like the ages and names were changing, as if the family story was being rewritten to hide a terrible truth. The most terrifying clue, though, came from the one place Clara felt safe: her school. She found drawings hidden between the pages of her students' math books while she was looking through them. Kids who lived on the ridge next door and passed the Fenwick farm on their way to school drew them. The drawings weren't very good, but it was clear what they meant. One picture showed a house with a dark hole in the ground next to it, and small stick-like figures with no faces being led toward the hole. Another showed a big figure standing over a row of small, still shapes that were under a floor. The kids couldn't say what they had seen in words, but they had drawn it. The middle point came with the rage of a summer storm. The Ozarks were hit by wind and rain for 2 days. The leaves fell off the trees, and the creeks rose above their banks. The sun came out on the 3rd day, and the news spread quickly. The storm uprooted a huge oak tree on the edge of the Fenwick property. Its roots were so tangled that they ripped the ground open, showing what was below. A group of men clearing a fallen log from the road saw it first. It was a bundle covered in rotting burlap. Little bones stuck out of a hole in the fabric. There was a single child's shoe next to it, half buried in the mud, with the laces still tied. Someone called the sheriff. He came, looked, and took the bundle. For a short time, it seemed like the secret had finally been ripped from the ground. It seemed like justice would come, but then a new, deeper silence fell. The sheriff's official report was never turned in. The records of the discovery just disappeared from his office. The county judge, who played cards with Ephraim Fenwick on Saturday nights, threw the whole thing out. He said the bones were just leftover remains from the war that hadn't been buried yet, which is a common thing to find in those parts. He told everyone to stop talking about it. The truth had been found, shown to the world for a shocking moment, and then it was buried again. This time, under the weight of official denial, the whispers stopped. The people next door looked away. The terrible story of the Fenwick family was now a secret that everyone in the county had to keep. As fall turned into winter in 1878, a deep silence fell over the hollows. The heavy snow made the roads impassable, cutting off the farms once more. This winter, though, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the calm quiet of a landscape at rest. It was the tense, watchful silence of a community holding its breath. Finding the bones and the quick official cover-up that followed changed everything. Fear grew stronger, becoming as much a part of the season as the cold wind and the long, dark nights. Clara Dobbins felt very alone on her own small farm. The school was closed until the spring thaw, so she spent her days by the fire with her private ledger of the Fenwick children open on her lap. She hadn't given up. Her determination grew stronger with each passing day. She wrote down each name that had disappeared on new paper, adding details from her memory like the color of a child's hair, a nervous habit, or a favorite story. She was determined that they would not be forgotten, even if the world outside chose to ignore them. But the Fenwick's power was greater than she thought it would be. There was a witness, a man who could have spoken up. Samuel Reich was a farm worker who had worked for the Fenwicks for a season the year before. He was a straightforward person who was known for being honest. Samuel had begun to speak after the bones were found. He talked to a few men at the feed store in a low voice about the nights he heard digging and the strange smell that sometimes came from the barn, which he said was like nothing natural. He talked about how angry Ephraim Fenwick could get and how Martha's tonic seemed to make the kids sleep too deeply. Samuel Reich was found dead in the creek 2 weeks after he started talking. The water was only about a foot deep. The sheriff said it was an accident because the man must have slipped on the icy bank and hit his head. But his wife had a different story to tell. She said her husband was a good swimmer and knew that creek like the back of his hand. She said he had been worried and that he had told her he had talked too much, and that Ephraim Fenwick had looked at him with eyes that were as cold as a snake's. The death of Samuel sent a clear message to the community. Being quiet was safe, and the effort to hide the truth went on. Clara went to the county office to make copies of her school rolls so she could add to her own records. Someone told her that the rolls from the last 2 years had been lost. They were gone, just like the sheriff's report. She asked the pastor at the church to see the baptismal registry. He was a nice guy, but he was also careful. He cared more about peace than anything else. He didn't want to show her the book, but he did. She found what she had been afraid of there. There were a lot of entries for kids who didn't have last names and were taken in by the church. These entries had been crossed out with thick black ink blots, making them impossible to read. They had even erased all the records of their existence. The Fenwicks were making their place in the community while the evidence of their crimes was being systematically destroyed. They started to show a new side of respectability. Ephraim gave a large amount of money to the church roof fund, and the pastor thanked him from the pulpit. Martha threw parties where she served coffee and cake to the same neighbors who talked about her behind her back. They walked through the town with an air of unshakable confidence. The predator wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. It was a neighbor, a well-known person in the area, whose smile was a mask and whose kindness was a weapon. They were buying the town's silence with one good deed at a time. Late one night, Clara's hopes for official justice were dashed for good. Someone knocked on her door. The circuit judge, a man she respected, had come all the way from the county seat. He didn't come in. He stood on her porch, his breath fogging up in the cold air, and spoke to her in a low, urgent voice. He told her to stop asking questions because it was best for her. He told her to forget about the past. He didn't say who sent him, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. The law, the very thing she had trusted to protect the innocent, was now protecting the guilty. Clara understood the whole terrible truth at that moment. There would be no official justice. The sheriff, the judge, and even the church had all been silenced or used. Now, the truth was only hers to bear. It was buried under the winter snow, under layers of fear and guilt, waiting. It was the long silence of winter, and she was alone, with only the names of the lost children to keep her company in the dark. Years went by. The quiet stayed. As Ephraim and Martha Fenwick got older, their faces became more like those of respectable old people. Kids ran past the farm in the hollow, and adults wouldn't talk about it. Clara Dobbins, who is now in her late 32nd, still teaches. Her hair is starting to turn gray at the temples. She kept her ledger, a private memorial to the children no one else seemed to remember, in a locked box under her bed. It looked like the truth had been successfully hidden. But, like bodies, secrets have a way of coming back to the surface. Martha Fenwick died in her sleep in 1889. Eliza Cartwright, her niece, came from street. Lewis to help her aunt's affairs after the funeral. Eliza was very different from her quiet, religious family. She was smart, interested, and didn't have much patience for the unspoken rules of the Ozarks. She could see the fear in the neighbors' eyes and feel the heavy silence that hung over the Fenwick house. She didn't want to leave the past alone, so she started to look through the farmhouse's long-neglected corners. She found a small wooden trunk in the attic, where it was covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. It was open. Inside was a secret stash of things that Martha had hidden away, a record of her own guilt and sadness. There were piles of kids' drawings that were almost exactly like the ones Clara had found years before. They were rough sketches of dark basements, faceless people, and a house that looked more like a prison. There was a stack of letters that Martha had written to her sister in Ohio. They were full of hidden confessions and requests for help, letters that had never been sent. There was a small Bible at the bottom of the trunk. The pages were stiff because they were old, and there was a list of initials written in pencil inside the front cover. Someone had violently erased the list, tearing the paper in the process. Eliza knew for sure that she had found the key to the family's dark secret, and it made her sick. She had heard the rumors about her aunt and uncle, but she had thought they were just small-town gossip. She understood now. that she was holding the trunk's contents. She loaded the trunk into her wagon and drove straight to Clara Dobbins's house without saying a word to her Uncle Ephraim. Clara was an old woman now, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were still sharp. Clara's hand started to shake when Eliza opened the trunk and put its contents on her small kitchen table. It was the proof she had been waiting for more than 10 years. The two women, one young and ashamed of something she had done, and the other old and angry about something that had happened a long time ago, started to work. They put together 20 years of absences by matching the initials in the Bible to the names in Clara's ledger. They looked at the dates when the kids went missing and compared them to the receipts from the feed store for quicklime and wood. The chain of facts got tighter, creating an unbreakable story of evil that was planned. The land itself seemed to be moving as they worked, as if it, too, couldn't keep the secret any longer. People in the neighborhood started talking again. They were less afraid of Ephraim now that he was older and sadder. They talked about noises coming from the sealed well on the Fenwick property, like a faint scratching sound that could be heard during the spring thaw. They said that the dogs on the farms around the Fenwick land wouldn't drink from the creek that ran by. They would whine and back away from the water's edge. It was as if the ground was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the things it held. Clara Dobbins finally got the weapon she needed with the proof from the trunk and her own careful notes. She didn't go to the sheriff or the judge because she had learned that lesson a long time ago. Instead, she went to see the editor of the local newspaper, a young man who believed in the power of words on paper. As she told him her story, his face grew paler with each detail. He looked over the drawings, the receipts, and the ledger. He said he would publish everything. The next week, the story was on the front page. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a simple, damning timeline. It gave the names of the kids who were missing, one after the other. There was a date next to each name, and next to that was an entry from a feed store ledger or a note from Clara's log. The community saw it in black and white. A child goes missing, and someone buys a bag of quicklime. Another one goes missing, and wood is bought for a new fence. It was a public record of the forgotten, open for everyone to see. The predator was finally found out. There was no trial and no conviction in a court of law. Ephraim Fenwick was too old, and the evidence wasn't strong enough for a court case. But the community's decision was quick and final. He got a name. People didn't want to be around him. His farm was empty, and stones thrown at night broke the windows of his house. The Fenwick family line, which used to be a source of quiet pride, became a source of shame. They had a bad name, and their reputation was ruined. The smiling mask had been ripped off, and the evil that had been hiding in the hollow for so long was finally shown to the world. After being publicly shamed, Ephraim Fenwick didn't live long. He died alone in the old farmhouse, a bitter and broken man, leaving behind only a piece of land that was cursed. The empty farm fell apart. The wind and time tore down its walls, and thorny brush grew over its fields. The story of the Fenwicks became a local legend, a scary story told to kids to scare them and remind adults of how dark things could be behind a friendly smile. The land stayed empty for 12 years, holding its breath. In 1901, a final, definitive reckoning came, not from man, but from nature itself. A son who had left for Arkansas long before the secret came out was the last member of the Fenwick family to die. He was in his 42nd, had cold eyes like his father's, and a greedy heart. He didn't come to mourn. He came to claim his inheritance. He planned to sell the land and get rid of the last trace of his family's shame. That spring, the rains came down hard and fast, more so than anyone had ever seen. The creeks turned into rivers, and the valleys filled with water. The ground on the old Fenwick property was so wet that it couldn't hold any more. The ground around the sealed well gave way with a loud groan. The stone cap, which had been set so tightly, fell in, and the walls of the well fell in, making a deep, muddy sinkhole. When the floodwaters went down, everyone could see the truth. The well that fell apart had shown what was inside. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds, of small bones stuck in the mud and broken stones. These included tiny ribs, fragile skulls, and the delicate bones of hands that had never grown to full size. The land itself had opened up to show the last, irrefutable proof. The truth had come back to life, in a very real way. There could be no denying or hiding this time. The last Fenwick son saw the physical proof of his family's crimes and ran away from the county overnight. He was never seen again. There would be no trial, but there would be a punishment. The community, finally free from the Fenwick shadow, came together to do what the law couldn't. There was a service in the churchyard. The Reverend Hale, who is now an old man, stood in front of the congregation with a voice full of feeling. He had the ledger that Clara Dobbins had kept for a long time in his hands. He said the names of the missing kids out loud, one by one: John, Sarah, Samuel, and Thomas. Once a secret whispered name, now spoken with respect and a prayer offered to the memory of a life cut short. It took a long time to read. It turned out that the list was much longer than anyone had thought. When the last name was read, the crowd felt a deep sense of peace. Finally, the kids got their names back. They had been counted. People had remembered them. A few weeks later, some men from the Veterans Hall went out to the hollow. They filled in the well that had fallen down and buried the bodies with respect. They took down the last rotting beams of the Fenwick house, burned what they could, and buried the rest. They put up a simple wooden marker in the middle of the cleared land. There were no names on it, just a simple inscription for the children who had died. The community had put its moral order back in place. The story was told and retold at supper tables, in the feed store, and at the Veterans Hall, ensuring that the lesson would not die. The official records had been wiped clean. The law didn't work. But the people's shared memory had turned out to be the strongest record of all. Their secret, which had been kept in stone and silence, had to answer to time. The land and the people both remembered.